Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this CISI webinar. I can just see that we've got more participants coming in to the room as we speak. So I'll just give that another few seconds before we kick off. All right, good stuff. So I think we're up to enough numbers here now. So, well, hello, everybody, and welcome to this very special CISI webinar on supporting vulnerable clients with confidence, a trauma-informed approach to breakup, divorce, and domestic abuse. Now, it's great to see so many of you join us online for this event, which is, of course, on a very important subject. Now, just to introduce myself, my name is Richard Bernstein, a Chartered Fellow of the CISI and a member of the Global Compliance Forum. And I've got the absolute pleasure of chairing today's event. And what a fantastic speaker we have for you today. But just before we do the formal introductions and I hand over to our guest speaker, our expert, I think it's important just to set the scene as to what we're about to talk about. Now, look, the topic of vulnerable clients, or should I say clients with characteristics of vulnerability, has been around for some time now, probably around about 5 years. The original FCA guidance came out in 2021, and it was a really helpful document in helping to shape the vulnerable client framework for many firms with the 4 key drivers of vulnerability and so on. And of course, since then, we've had the consumer duty, we've had good and bad practice documents, FCA updates, events, and much more. And we've seen many speeches and podcasts and all the rest of it from senior folks at the FCA. And we've heard quotes like, vulnerability is the lens through which we're looking at firms' consumer duty compliance. And if firms can't get vulnerability right, particularly the identification, then how are they getting their target market and client segmentation right? So real confirmation that it's a super important subject. But notwithstanding all of this, really the underlying guidance hasn't changed for the past 5 years. The fundamentals remain the same, and it remains a very, very important topic. Now, I'm sure many of you watching, many of our CISI members and our guests have either given or received training on this topic, but it's clear that it remains one of the most important, interesting and challenging subjects with a real evidential link to good and fair client outcomes. And look, it's really, really easy for compliance people like me to talk about frameworks and policies and training. But for any client facing person who's there, so any investment manager, financial planner, wealth planner, and so on, you're the one in front of these clients. And you'll come across a wide range of vulnerabilities and client situations. And of course, you all know how sensitive these matters can be. And none more so than the matter of breakup, divorce, and domestic abuse. And that's why I'm absolutely delighted to introduce our expert speaker, Sara Davison. She's known as the divorce coach, and Sara's a global expert in breakup, divorce, and domestic abuse recovery. She's a five-time best-selling author, podcast host, and media commentator, and the founder of the International Divorce Coach Center of Excellence. And with over 16 years of experience working exclusively in this field, Sara supported thousands of individuals through high conflict separation, coercive control, post-separation escalation, and much more. She delivers corporate training for global organizations, law firms, financial professionals like us, helping us all understand and better support clients navigating emotionally complex situations. Sara is also a patron of the Dash charity and a survivor of domestic abuse herself, so brings both professional expertise and lived experience to her work. So look, you don't really want to hear any more from me. So I'll hand over to Sara, who's got some presentation slides to talk through. The Q&A is in operation throughout this presentation, so please feel free to drop any questions in there, and then I'll pop back on at the end and we'll go through some Q&A. So that's all of the preamble. Sara, over to you for the main event.
Oh, thank you so much, Richard, for that amazing introduction, and welcome everybody. And a big thank you to CISI for inviting me to speak to you all today. And I'm really touched at how many people registered and how many people have booked to show up today. So thank you so much. This is a personal mission for me as a survivor of domestic abuse. And I've put together as much value as I possibly can pack into about half an hour talking. So we've got space for questions as well at the end. So I'm going to crack on with the presentation, but if you've got questions, pop them in the Q&A, because I really want to make sure I answer all your questions and give you as much value as I can in our time together today. And I want to start by asking you a question. How many of you have worked with a client who just seemed completely different from the person who sat in front of you a couple of months before, maybe? Maybe they missed some deadlines, maybe they changed their mind repeatedly, or forgot some of the information you'd already discussed, or became unusually emotional, which I know can be difficult to handle. Or sometimes maybe simply just seem unable to make decisions that you would expect them to normally make with ease. And I think the challenge is that we often see the behavior, but not what's sitting directly underneath it and not necessarily what's driving it. And that's what I've been working in this field for 16 years now. And as a survivor myself and someone that was catapulted out of my own marriage about 17 years ago now, I've gone through the process as a victim turned survivor now. And now I spend my time, as Richard said, helping people to cope better with any kind of breakup, divorce, and domestic abuse. But as I've been working with clients for many, many years, I've been a coach for 30 years now, but in this field for coming up to 16, 17 years, what I've realized is that me and my coaches in my training school, I've got a training school where I've trained over 800 coaches in 31 different countries to support clients. But what we find is there's education needed and awareness raising needed with the other professionals that they're interacting with during the times when they are most vulnerable. So again, thank you for being here. I'm very excited to be able to go through these slides with you now. So my question was, have you worked with a client who has missed deadlines, changed their mind repeatedly? And let's think about this. Is there someone who's frustrated you? Maybe someone who seems inconsistent, someone who made a process a lot harder than you felt it needed to be. Perhaps they delayed returning some information. Perhaps they repeatedly changed their instructions to you. Maybe they appeared disengaged. Now, I'd like to challenge what is a very common assumption. What if those behaviors weren't actually the problem? What if they were symptoms? Because one of the biggest mistakes that professionals make is judging behavior without understand what's actually driving it. And that brings me to the first concept that I want to share with you today, and that is the iceberg effect. Now, one of the most consistent patterns that I've seen with over the last 16 years is what I call this iceberg effect. And this is when professionals meet clients who are navigating, maybe it's a breakup or a divorce, but they're only seeing the very tip of the iceberg. And above the surface, the client often appears composed. Now, they might be successful, intelligent, professional. They might even arrive prepared with notes and questions for you. But under the surface can be an entirely different reality. They may not be sleeping. They may be receiving hostile messages from their ex every single day, more than one. They may be worried about losing their home. They might be carrying a huge burden of uncertainty about what's next in their future. They might be trying to protect their children from conflict, one of the biggest, most emotional challenges that any parent can face. And they might also be struggling with shame, anxiety, and fear. More often than not, I see clients dealing with all of these at one single time. But the distance between what is visible and what is hidden explains much of what professionals can misinterpret as maybe resistance or inconsistency or disengagement. So let me give you an example of that. I I had a client, I'm going to call her Rebecca for this example, and she came to see me, but she'd been seeing a professional, a financial professional, shortly after separating from her husband. And after first meeting, she really did look like the kind of client that would be an ideal client, I guess, for anyone. So she was organized, she brought detailed notes, she asked very thoughtful, thought out questions. She seemed focused, she seemed engaged. Everything was to suggest that she would move very smoothly through the process. But then things began to change. She started to miss deadlines. She cancelled meetings. She sent contradictory emails. She forgot information that she'd already been given. She repeated questions that had been previously answered, in some cases several times. And her advisor began to get understandably a little bit frustrated from his perspective at this point. And he started questioning whether she was actually even taking the process seriously. Eventually, and we'll come on to why not immediately, but eventually Rebecca disclosed what was actually happening for her. She was receiving daily hostile messages from her ex-husband. She was only sleeping 3, maybe 4 hours a night. She was also working full time and managing childcare all on her own, trying to navigate as well the emotional roller coaster of the separation and carrying that constant fear of what is separation, which was going to be about her financial survival. How was she going to cope with that? So, what looked like inconsistency was actually exhaustion. What looked like confusion was total overwhelm. And what looked like disengagement was purely survival. Now, once that particular advisor understood what was happening beneath the surface, everything started to shift. So, communication slowed right down. Decision making was broken into smaller stages, and he followed up after every meeting with a summary in writing. Expectations of what she was going to do in between meetings was made more realistic. And that really improved Rebecca's ability to engage. Not And this is interesting, not because she suddenly became more capable, but because she felt psychologically steadier. Now, that's something we're going to come on to on this slide because this is really important. If you only take one thing away, please let it be this. Many professionals will assume that they are dealing with a capability issue. The client doesn't understand, maybe the client isn't intelligent enough, or they just lack that financial knowledge. But very often, the issue is not capability, what someone is able to do. It's capacity. And that is what someone is currently able to access. So capability is someone's underlying ability, but capacity is their ability to access that ability in the moment. So, for example, if you imagine a successful CEO or, say, even a surgeon or a senior partner, or a business owner, nobody would actually question their capability. But what happens when you put that same person into a high conflict divorce and you add months of no sleep, you add financial uncertainty, you add the fear for their children and what they're dealing with, you add the hostile communication from the ex, and suddenly they struggle to make decisions that they would normally make really easily. Now, interestingly here, the capability hasn't disappeared, but their capacity has reduced. And when we understand that distinction, our response changes. We understand that and stop asking questions like, well, what's wrong with this client? We start asking, what is this client carrying right now? And this shift alone can cause a massive shift and transformation in your client's outcomes from working with you. Now, one of the reasons breakup and divorce cause so much vulnerability is because they rarely just affect one area of life. They impact pretty much your entire life. A work problem, for example, will affect your work. And if you've got a health problem, that affects your health. But breakup and divorce, they're completely different. They create what I call this ripple effect. So if you imagine a pebble dropping into a pond, the impact doesn't stay in one place. It spreads, it ripples outwards. And this is exactly the same thing that happens in a relationship breakdown because the client isn't just dealing with a divorce. They might be potentially dealing with having to move house and the sale of a home. And we know that's up there with some of the most traumatic experiences we have to deal with, on top of divorce being the second most traumatic experience we ever go through in life, second only to death of a loved one. They might also be dealing with changes to their childcare arrangements. They might have new financial responsibilities. If they're dealing with a divorce, they have the legal process. Then changes to their friendships and their social networks, changes to their identity. So they're always potentially in many of my client cases, they've got another half. Now they're just on their own, and that often feels like being left just as a half. So they're having to process that change to their identity. Also changes to their future plans, what's coming next, that fairy tale ending they had planned, that's all gone now. So the loss of certainty, the loss of routine, the loss of stability can really cause huge issues. So again, when we're working with vulnerable clients, we can't compartmentalize breakup and divorce into one box because this has a massive ripple effect and multiple disruptions. I was working with another client, and I call her Eve. Within 3 months, she'd had to sell her house. She'd moved to a new area. She'd had to reorganize her entire childcare for 3 children. She'd adjusted her working hours so to be able to manage the different commutes and the different childcare. She had to manage escalating communication, and that's a polite way of putting it, from her ex. And she'd had to take responsibility for finances that she'd never had the experience of managing those independently on her own before. So in meetings, she appeared distracted. She was very slow at decision making. For her, the paperwork was totally overwhelming. And for some of the people dealing with her, the professionals, so in all the different areas that she was being supported, she came across as appearing quite difficult. And her reaction was not crying or closing down. It would be being snappy and more irritable and slightly angry at times. But the truth here is she wasn't difficult. She was overloaded. And this is important because when we can understand the ripple effect, we stop expecting people to perform at their normal level during an abnormal period of their life. And that's when their behavior starts to actually make more sense. So let's look at why smart clients make poor financial decisions. Now, this is where neuroscience becomes really highly relevant, actually, to this situation. Um, because when someone feels unsafe, so that could be emotionally unsafe, financially unsafe, physically unsafe, their nervous system is going to shift into survival mode. Now, survival mode will change how your brain functions. Working memory reduces. It will be harder to process information as well. You can imagine that concentration decreases as well. Decision fatigue increases. So after a period of time, it's just going to get slower and harder for clients to do. At the same time, you're dealing with emotional reactivity. That's going up because you're trying to deal with the emotional roller coaster that you've been strapped on, and you're going up and down, up and down. There's 5 stages to the loss cycle of grief that clients go through, and that will take them oscillating from feeling angry and sad to disassociated to depressed to acceptance at times, and then sliding right back. And again, there'll be triggers, there'll be different things that come up during that process, plus combining it with that individual's natural coping mechanisms. And if you think about it, we never consciously ever sit down and choose our coping mechanisms. There's no class at school where Miss Smith sits us down and says, "Hey kids, today we're going to look at how you're going to cope with stress and what you're going to do in those moments." As you get older through life and things don't work out, we just adopt them from learning from other people around us or watching movies or other influences, that we just do things. So drinking, smoking, partying, all those things. Or it might be excessively exercising. It might be isolating. It could be so many different things. But for most clients, they've never consciously chosen them, but many of them have a negative impact. So all these things are going on with their emotional reactivity. So obviously that is when their executive functioning is going to start to decrease and decline. Basically, your brain is just becoming less effective at doing the things that you probably need your clients to actually do. So take in information or maybe compare different options, retaining information. If you imagine you're in fight and flight mode, and that reduces your ability to really have anything else in your brain for a long period of time. So making decisions is going to be hard, and following through and actually completing actions is also going to be really challenging too. So again, we've got to look at all the different things that are going on for clients there. And this is really why a lot of clients ask the same questions repeatedly as well, because they're forgetting the conversations. And that's why they delay decision making and why they struggle to complete paperwork. Again, it's not necessarily a lack of intelligence, it's often a nervous system that's under massive pressure. And I often ask professionals this question: have you ever had a client ask the same question 3 times despite you answering it clearly? And almost every person puts their hand up, yes. And yet, most professionals will assume the issue again is capability, but more often than not, it comes back to capacity. So when people are feeling overwhelmed, the brain is basically prioritizing survival over strategy. And that's something that every professional needs to understand when you're working with vulnerable clients. Now, there is a hidden cost of misunderstanding vulnerability. Um, and let's look at this from a business perspective, because understanding vulnerability, it's not about simply being compassionate. It's not just about that. It's also about effectiveness. Because when you understand vulnerability, it can reduce your own frustration when you're dealing with these clients. Because as communication breaks down, clients are disengaging, delays get longer, the process becomes longer, and quite often the outcomes can deteriorate. And I've seen this with my own clients. The irony there is that both parties are becoming frustrated because the professional's thinking the client is engaging and the client's feeling overwhelmed and in many cases totally misunderstood. So nobody is winning there. And I know that the Consumer Duty places a significant emphasis on understanding vulnerability and driving good outcomes. But regardless of any regulation, this is simply good client care and a really essential toolkit for you to master, to raise awareness. Because when we understand what is driving behavior, we're going to communicate differently. We're going to adapt our approach. We're going to provide information in a more manageable way. And that in turn is going to accelerate your progress. Now, interesting here, the client hasn't changed, but our understanding of our client has. And that's key. Okay, so domestic abuse, what most professionals miss. Now, let's talk a bit about domestic abuse. And when I talk about this a lot, and I'm the patron of a domestic abuse charity, I'm a survivor myself, what I find is that most people automatically think of physical violence. And that's really understandable because actually in the UK, we used to call it domestic violence. In the States, you still do. But in the UK, we've changed it to domestic abuse because it covers so much more. And whilst physical abuse is visible, it's easier to see, although victims are very good at covering that up. What I've learned through 16 years of working in this field is that abuse, most domestic abuse starts long before physical violence ever occurs. In fact, in many abusive relationships, it never becomes physically violent at all. Although important for you to know, and this is quite a shocking statistic, I'm not saying it to shock you, but just to give you a depth of understanding of why this training is so important and the raising awareness is so important. 30% of domestic homicides happen within 3 months of separation. 30% of domestic homicides happen within 3 months of separation. And what I think is more chilling than that is that 80% of those murders, there was never any physical violence before. So if you can think of a client coming to you saying, right, I don't have all the financial information, okay, maybe I can pop home and get it now that I'm not living there anymore and the kids are now safe. Maybe I can pop back. They've never been violent before. I'm sure it'll be fine. I'm hoping this will maybe raise awareness for you to think that may not be a safe idea because it isn't. Domestic abuse is actually best understood as a pattern of behavior designed to gain control and power over another person. It's not a single argument. It's not one bad day. It's not someone losing their temper once. It's actually repeated, consistent patterns over a period of time. It's a pattern that often escalates over time and a pattern that gradually is going to reduce your client's confidence over time. It reduces autonomy and it creates dependency on the perpetrator. Now, the reason this matters to professionals is because many of the effects will show up in your client meetings long before anyone ever uses the word abuse. Most clients are not going to walk into your office and say, I'm experiencing coercive control or domestic abuse. They'll show you behaviors, and that's why awareness becomes so, so, so important. So you can see what's going on. Now, financial abuse often hides in plain sight. It's also one of the least understood areas because financial abuse, again, it's not about an income level, it's not about wealth, it's not about education, it's all about control. A client might have substantial assets, be wealthy, and still be being financially abused. They might be highly educated and still have very limited access to financial information. Financial abuse spans many things, and I'm sure you're aware of a lot of them here, but restricting access to bank accounts, monitoring spending. I had a client recently who had to come home after work every day and produce receipts for anything she bought during the day. And it wasn't just providing receipts, it was also then having to justify why she bought a cup of coffee rather than taking a flask in the morning. And again, her understanding of that was, well, he's much better at the finances than I am, so therefore that's that, you know, therefore he's just helping and looking after me. Many clients won't realize they're in abusive relationships. And again, abuse happens to both men and women, and we support both men and women. It is predominantly a gender-based issue, so more women. However, it does happen to men and women, and I support many men actually in my personal clinic. So again, it could be preventing someone to getting a job as well, so they can't earn money, or restricting their ability. It could be hiding assets. It could be creating debt in someone's name. It can be withholding financial information that often comes out during a divorce process when you're supposed to give full access to your information, and that's not happening. Basically, they're using money as a tool of control. So one of my clients, and call her Jane, was a senior executive in a big blue chip company, highly capable, very successful, to the outside world, appeared completely independent. Yet, during her marriage, her husband controlled every significant financial decision. So when the separation began, she discovered debts that she had that she knew nothing about. She had savings that she couldn't access. She had documents that she just couldn't get her hands on. Funds were withheld, very common during a divorce process with a toxic ex. Information was hidden. Information was requested coming across when it did, either late or confusing layouts or not formatted. Despite being a really successful professional, she was absolutely terrified. And at one stage, she was even thinking about going back to the relationship, not because she wanted to, but because she was absolutely terrified of financial ruin. And that is the power of financial abuse. That's why you guys are actually very often uniquely positioned to spot the signs that other people might miss. You might actually be one of the first professionals to notice that something doesn't quite add up. And this isn't because you're investigating abuse, it's because you understand finances. And when finances don't make sense, it very often points to something bigger happening beneath the surface. Now, why clients rarely tell you? Most people are not going to disclose abuse directly. And so that potentially makes it harder to spot, right? Because they're not telling you. But I think this is one of the biggest misconceptions that many professionals have, is that if abuse is happening, then the client is going to tell you. And in reality, many are not. In fact, some of the people experiencing the most serious forms of abuse may never use the word abuse at all. Now, why? You might be asking why. Well, as a survivor myself, I totally relate to this because I didn't know I was in an abusive relationship when I left my marriage. The thing is, domestic abuse is gradual. Many people don't realize it's happening until years into the relationship, or even when they left, because you have to adapt. You have to normalize, and minimalize these horrific behaviors, make excuses for them, blame ourselves, because we're simply focused on surviving. And also, it can be really embarrassing to be talking about it, especially if you're perceived as a highly successful person as well. But even if you're not, and I've worked with a huge range of different people, but CEOs, lawyers, doctors, celebrities, ultra high net worth clients. And they all say to me, how did I let this happen? Like, if I tell anyone, they're going to think I'm completely stupid because I should have seen the signs. And that often comes from having told people who go, well, why didn't you just leave? Again, another really common question posed to victims, survivors of abuse. But there is enormous shame attached to abuse. And then on top of that, there is fear. There's the fear of retaliation, the fear of losing your children. And for those of you that haven't heard of this, there is a really huge issue with victims of abuse losing their children to perpetrators through the family court system globally. But this happens today in the UK because if you think about a client, a victim of abuse, very often their trauma responses in court are misinterpreted. That's a polite way for it, I would say, right now. But we're not going to get onto that topic because talking to you guys today, not in Parliament campaigning, which I spend a lot of my time doing. But often a trauma response may look like someone's confused, emotionally unstable, overprotective of your children, if that is even possible. So there's the fear of losing your children. There's also the fear of financial ruin, the fear of making the situation worse, which means the signs professionals see are often behavioral rather than verbal. So the client who constantly seeks permission, they might be fearful of communication. They might change their position after they've spoken to their partner if they're still in that relationship. They might seem unusually anxious around money. These are all often clues. This is why awareness matters because we're rarely looking for disclosures, we're actually looking for patterns. Coercive control, bit of a buzzword, it's in the press a lot, but what does it mean? Um, One of the most misunderstood forms of domestic abuse, I think. And that's because it's usually not very dramatic, it's subtle, it's gradual, it's often actually invisible to anyone outside of the relationship because it works through restriction of autonomy. And at first, it can even look like care, like, oh, I'm just worried about you, or I just want you to know you're safe, or well, I'm better at managing the finances than you, so I'll do that. I'll take that off your plate. But over time, that person's world becomes smaller. Their confidence reduces, their independence decreases as well. Their decision making becomes influenced by fear. One of my clients described it perfectly. She said, I felt like I was walking on eggshells. And that phrase will come up time and time again. They're trying not to trigger any conflict. They're trying not to upset their ex. They're trying not to make the wrong decision. And over time, this actually changes behavior because the person then begins to second guess themselves at every turn. They seek reassurance. They avoid making independent decisions. And eventually they might just appear indecisive. Whereas what's happening in reality is that they've been conditioned not to trust their own judgment. They disassociate from trusting their gut or their instinct that maybe you might rely on just naturally. So this is why it's particularly important for you because independent decision making is probably very central to your work. Yet some clients have just spent years being taught not to trust themselves. So this isn't a financial literacy issue, that's a trauma issue. Okay, separation doesn't always end abuse. Sometimes it escalates it. Now, this is again something that surprises a lot of people. There's actually a common belief that once you separate from an abusive ex, the abuse will end. And unfortunately, that is just simply not true. Post-separation abuse is one of the biggest issues we have globally with victims leaving a perpetrator. In fact, at many points, many times, it's actually the point of separation that escalates that level of abuse. Now, why is that? That's because the control is being challenged. They're leaving, so the control's lessening. The person who previously had control is going to feel like they're losing it. So they're going to change the way they approach that. They're going to get some new methods, so particularly around finances. So I've seen situations where documents disappear, assets become very difficult to trace, maintenance payments are withheld, legal processes are being weaponized, administrative demands become relentless, which again all chips away at the victim who's already in a really vulnerable position. The goal of the perpetrator is not resolution. The goal is exhaustion. Because when the client is exhausted, when the vulnerable client is exhausted, they're going to maybe give in to demands. So this obviously matters enormously for you because you're supporting people right in the middle of this process. So what looks like disorganization may actually be that administrative overwhelm. What looks to you like indecision is probably going to be fear. What looks like avoidance is probably survival. And again, it comes back to the same principle. Behavior makes more sense when we understand what sits beneath it. Okay, trauma-informed communication. Again, really, really important here. Let's move into what you actually can do. Okay, I want to give you some tools. So, because awareness without any application isn't particularly useful, the good news is that trauma-informed communication is often about small changes rather than major changes. The first principle is curiosity over judgment. So instead of asking, why haven't they done this? Maybe asking what might be making this difficult is a better question. The second principle is reducing cognitive overload. So remember what we were talking about before, when people are overwhelmed, their capacity reduces. So rather than presenting, say, 10 different actions, let's just present 3. Rather than discussing 5 decisions, focus on 1. Following up conversations in writing, providing really clear next steps and breaking that complexity down into manageable chunks. Also, I like to add in we rather than you. So if you're working as a team with your client, I can't tell you how much it resonates better with clients when you say, don't worry, we will get through this together. We can look at this and getting their agreement. Are you okay with focusing on this today? And then maybe next time we can focus on that. But for now, let's focus on this. So again, we and us and working as a team is so much more helpful and trauma informed than you go away, you do this, you do this. So we're going to focus on this, you're going to do this. You see, it's a shift, very small shift to we and teamwork. The third principle is creating psychological safety because people think more clearly when they feel safe. So absolutely does not mean agreeing with everything they're saying. It just means communicating calmly, so predictably and clearly. And finally, remembering that your role is you're not being asked to become a therapist and you're not being asked to diagnose abuse and you're not being asked to become safeguarding experts. Your role is still financial planning. But when you understand how trauma-informed behavior and how when you understand how trauma is going to impact your client's behavior, their communication and their decision making, you become significantly more effective with your client. And that is really, I guess, the essence of trauma-informed practice. It's not changing your profession, it's strengthening it. So I've created, because I know I've done a lot of talking, I've created a vulnerable client red flag checklist. So you can scan the QR code here to download your copy. I think it will be a useful tool for you just to take away and have in case you're thinking, how do I know? How do I spot the signs? So I want to leave you as a wrap up with 3 key messages. The first one is that behavior is information. So if a client is looking reactive or maybe withdrawn, indecisive, or overwhelmed, there's usually a reason. The behavior itself is rarely going to be the problem. The behavior is often the signal. It's a clue. It's a piece of information telling us that something else might be happening beneath the surface. The second is the distinction between capacity and capability. And I genuinely believe that this is one of the most valuable concepts professionals can understand. Obviously, many of the clients you work with are highly capable people with successful careers and families, business, maybe wealth. Yet during periods of trauma, their capacity may temporarily reduce. The capability is still there, it still remains, but their capacity is going to fluctuate. And the more we recognize that distinction, the more patient and understanding, the more effective we can be in helping clients move forward. The third message is that abuse is often hidden. many clients will never disclose directly. They may not even know they're in an abusive relationship, which means awareness really matters. Not because you're expected to diagnose or investigate, but because awareness changes interpretation, and interpretation will change the outcomes. And when we understand what's happening beneath the surface, we communicate differently. And when we communicate differently, clients perform better, not because they have changed, but because they feel safer, calmer, and more understood. And that is the power of the trauma-informed response. So you can scan that QR code. Also, if you do want to go deeper on this, everything I've covered today is to raise awareness. Obviously, I've been speaking for about 30 minutes, 40 minutes. There's a lot more if you really want to go and get a CPD accredited online training. It takes about 4 hours online. You can do it on the train on the way to work, and you will get a CPD accreditation at the end of it. But I'm giving you all the tools, trauma-informed information there, role play scripts, understanding on a much deeper level inside the training to help you. We've really only scratched the surface. And also, I talk about professional boundaries, safeguarding considerations. We have the online training, which is super simple and easy to do. But I also do corporate trainings, lunch and learn webinars. We support employees as well. Me and my team of coaches, we actually do one-to-one support with clients as well. So if you wanted to refer clients for the emotional support, we would always be welcome to that. So I just want to finish by saying thank you so much for being here. This is such an important awareness need for professionals. And I know that by just being here today, but if for those of you that want to go on and get the accreditation in breakup, divorce, and domestic abuse awareness, that again will help so many clients to cope better with the process, knowing that other members of their team are trauma informed and aware and communicating in a trauma informed way. But also, this doesn't just help people, it also saves lives. So thank you for being here and for listening. Richard, over to you.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Sara, for a truly fascinating and enlightening presentation. And personally, I can say that I've learned a huge amount there. Some of the concepts, the iceberg effect, capability and capacity, the ripple effect, and some of the tools and techniques that you've shared there were really fascinating. And I'm sure many of our participants have taken the same as well. And we have had some questions come through. So, Sara, I'll go to some of those now. So the first question that's come through is, what are the biggest misconceptions you see regarding domestic abuse?
I think the fact that once you've left your partner, it gets easier. And I try to sort of mention that in the training because it's so important to realize that just because they're not physically living with their partner anymore doesn't mean that they are emotionally disassociated. So what that means is very often an ex can still basically be renting space in their head 24/7. It's like having an intimate terrorist. I think Nigella Lawson coined that phrase many years back now, but it really resonates with survivors because we know what it feels like. Even if we're not with them, even if we're not around them, they can still send a message or communicate through a financial professional. One of my clients recently, she was working with a financial professional who's working with her husband and with her, and he kept using her husband's name. Now, unbeknownst to this particular professional, because he hasn't done my training, he was using the ex's name time and time again, unaware of the trauma response that was generating in my client, his client as well. So again, it's small things that can make a massive difference. And sometimes I think we don't realize the impacts. Clients aren't always going to verbalize that.
Yeah, absolutely. And when I did the intro to this webinar, I talked about wealth planners, financial advisors who are sitting there in front of clients and are dealing with all these really, really difficult and sensitive situations. Another question that's come through in that regard is around how we can become better equipped to help colleagues, to help clients deal with some of those sensitive issues that do come up.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, Richard, I'm going to say do my training, right?
Of course.
Obviously, but I think really just being open and curious and understanding what's out there, but also if you've got an HR department or an HR team that you use, speaking to them, see what your company's policy is. Every firm should have a domestic abuse policy now. It's not actually compulsory, but it's one of my campaigns in Parliament with an MP called Jess Asato, to try and make it compulsory so that you do have a step-by-step action list of what to do. And if a client comes to you who is disclosing abuse or you suspect it, then obviously following your firm's HR policy has got to be important there. But again, making sure that they are registered with a local domestic abuse charity. When I say local, local to them. We're very fortunate in the UK that we have very good, excellent domestic abuse charities, but they are small usually, and there's some national ones, nationwide ones, but most of them are local. So they have to go to the one local to where they live. This will then ensure that they're connected with local services and that there's a record. Also, it gives them someone who believes them, who's a professional who understands them, but can put them in touch with things like refuge, social services, police, fire brigade. One of the most common issues with perpetrators is firebombing through letterboxes. So I know these are things that probably seem so far distant from what you're dealing with on a day-to-day basis, but this is all potential issues for anybody dealing with domestic abuse. And obviously, as I explained, the statistics are horrifying after separation, which, if you're dealing with clients in that specific period, is really important that you have done as much as you can to be as aware as you can.
Excellent. No, thank you. That's a super interesting. One other question that's just come through on the Q&A is around many people not recognizing themselves as victims of abuse because there's no physical abuse, but they are paralyzed by coercive control. I think you covered a lot of it in the slides in the presentation, but are there any super effective ways to help financial professionals identify such abuse, even if the individual themselves isn't aware it's happening?
If you think and feel that something's not right, it's probably not right. Um, and trust your instinct, because if you're working with clients, you've been working with lots of clients, there is a scale of abuse. There can be with someone who's just very difficult, stubborn, selfish, but then there's the whole other side of that spectrum, which is literally terrifying. And because clients aren't necessarily going to speak about it, being able to spot the signs, which is why I put on the free downloadable guide there for the client red flag checklist. And that basically is a list of red flags that if these are coming up, it's not a guaranteed though. I mean, the thing is here, I don't want to overstep the mark of making you kind of think that you've now empowered to go and diagnose what is abuse and what isn't, because that's a very different sort of years of training, and that's something that isn't needed in what you're doing. My goal is to raise awareness so that if a red flag comes up, it's like, oh, it might be, it doesn't mean it is. It's a potential. So you can then just become more aware. What we've got to focus on is what can you control? Like, you can't solve their problems, right? So with the domestic abuse, you can help them hopefully with the finance side, but you're not going to be solving their problems with the other side. So, but how you can massively help your clients is by being trauma informed and adopting trauma informed language, trauma informed communication styles, and just the way you're structuring your sessions, the way that you are communicating over periods of time, and encouraging them and being supportive, but within professional boundaries. So that would be key.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, we've had another question come through, but I think you've just covered it really around tricky situations that around boundaries that financial professionals find themselves in. So you often get the feedback that you're right, then they're not therapists, they're not professionals, they're not medical professionals, but they are financial services professionals. And how do they really draw that distinction and maintain those professional boundaries, which I know is a key challenge for many people that come across these situations.
Yeah, and don't underestimate the impact of disclosures or worrying about a client, as I'm sure you already know. But self-care is really important in this. And obviously, when I'm training my coaches in my training school or supporting clients, self-care is something that we build in. But as professionals, very often we don't think about that for ourselves. So it's really important that you think about how you process the stress that's coming your way so you can maintain professional boundaries. I would just make it really clear to clients that you will do your best and work with them. You are trauma informed. If you do my training, I do put it out on all my socials. I have a large social following so that clients who follow me, who are looking for a specialist who can support them, will see that. So again, like no, letting people know you're trauma informed. So you will get clients like that, but knowing that you've got other people in your team like me or other people you may know who are specialists in this field that you can refer to for the emotional side. And if you can set that out up front with clients and say, look, I'm trauma informed, which means I can help you through this, I understand this is going to be difficult, and I have a support team for the emotional side. So, why don't you check in with, I founded the Breakup and Divorce Club where they can come in, it's less than £7.50 a month, and there's online coaching in there so they can find their tribe, get coaching, they can get discounts on one-to-one coaching. So we offer that. We are the only specialists in breakup, divorce and domestic abuse in the world, but in the way that we do it with coaching. But obviously you could, if you work with therapists or other specialists or specialist domestic abuse counselors, you can refer to them. So you don't need to step out of your lane, but again have a team of people that can support you to do the right thing. Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. No, thank you. And well, one more question that's just come through on our chat here. And actually, it's more of a statement than a question, but it's quite interesting. It's around custody and divorce disputes and abusers frequently using litigation, so ongoing
Mm.
legal abuse, to implement some control over their sort of other half. Have you ever come across that or seen any situations where that would be an issue?
Well, that is actually my specialist area, Richard. I specialize in helping clients dealing with when the legal process is being weaponized against them. So
Mm,
that very often means using the children as a pawn. There's a pseudo-scientific theory called parental alienation. I deal with the fallout of that every day and support clients through it. And it's the biggest scandal actually that's happening in the family court system that isn't known because the family court system is very locked, not transparent. We don't have transparency in the family courts. You can't talk about your experiences, ironically, to protect the children who are actually being damaged, in my opinion, from the system. But that's why I do a lot of campaigning. I was in Parliament last week with Jess Phillips and some other really key MPs who are making changes and bringing things around. But yes, one of the challenges you may see is that they are terrified because they're worried about the impact on their kids. A lot of the work that I've developed, I have a son who's now 17, but when his dad left, he was only one. So I've had 16 years of experience of raising someone who has a parent that may not have the same parenting opinions as me. And having been dragged through the family courts many times personally over the years, I've created tools and techniques to help clients, especially with those kind of situations. And that's probably what I'm best known for, creating those fast, positive changes in my private clinic with clients who are specifically dealing with those really tough emotional challenges.
sure. No, that's really interesting. I'm sure there's some super helpful resources there for that particularly difficult area. Um, just one more question that we've got in the time available around sort of anything we haven't covered yet. So any anonymous stories around how these issues have impacted your own clients, the things you've seen in your own experience as a coach and an expert in this area.
Yeah, I think one of the things that people don't really speak about very often is the fact that um, the impact that these issues, breakup, divorce, and domestic abuse, has on your workplace ability to actually be productive. And Harvard Business Journal did some research that showed that all of those issues, but predominantly breakup, divorce, reduce productivity in the workplace by 40%. And that's
Wow.
not just for 1 year, it's actually for the year before the breakup as it's falling apart, the relationship's falling apart, the year of the breakup, and then the year after, because again, just because the divorce is done doesn't mean they're okay. That's when most people are going, oh my God, I don't recognize my life. I'm in a new home, I've got a different commute. So all those issues, a lot of people don't want to speak to HR teams. I and my team, we go in and we support clients. So a lot of businesses, like I work with the British government, Volvo, Dell, Regatta, company, and lots of smaller companies too, but they have us on their books for when their employees are going through it because they realize it's not just a well-being issue, it's also a financial bottom line issue for the business because absenteeism goes up by at least 25%, days taken off sick, poor judgment, not being able to lead a team, it also reduces productivity of your team and your team leader by up to 5%. So you've got this sort of ripple effect within the business of one person going through a breakup, which is bringing the whole productivity down, which is a huge impact year after year on a business financially too. So I think that's something that's not really thought about. And again, a lot of people compartmentalize relationship breakdown in that little box. But with the ripple effect that I explained earlier, you can see how it is really much more widespread than that. And if you're dealing with these issues, yes, you can maybe not talk about it at work, but you definitely can't leave it at home because it's something that is all consuming. And in the training, I actually talk about how we go into that flight or fight and we're constantly just in survival mode, which means any other functionality is massively reduced, understandably. But the good news is, so we end on a positive, there is help out there. I mean, I've spent my life designing things. I've literally just released one of my books, Screw You, Watch This, How to Recover from Toxic Relationships for the general public, which is all about how to cope with these kind of issues and my tools. But there is help out there. There are people that are trained that can help and can fast track and help clients turn their pain into their superpower. Like, we don't have to be defined by what happens to us. It's what we do about it that makes us the people we are in life. So there is always a chance to take your power back, to turn your life around. And that Screw You, Watch This title of my book is very much the motto for clients to say, come on, you can turn this around and learn from it and become stronger. Because once you understand what abuse is and you're not going to repeat the patterns, you're in a much more empowered state, and your children can be too. It can be a valuable life lesson for you and your children. So hopefully that's a positive note to end on, Richard, that gives people a bit of hope.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And we've talked about a very serious subject today. So no, it's great to see that it can turn out well. There are positive endings to it if people approach it in the right way. So just one final thing, Sarah. So any closing remarks, any important takeaways? If there's one thing that all of our viewers should take away from today's presentation, what would that be?
That by becoming more aware, you are definitely making a difference that you probably can't even quantify or see. Some of the really small tools that we've talked about today or that are in the training will really shift the dial for clients. And that will make it a much better environment for them. And that if we can all come together and raise awareness, and that people start to step up and not just acknowledge this is a big, big issue for many clients, and they don't have to disclose it to be dealing with it, that if you have those skills, you'll naturally then be able to better support your clients and, as I said before, save lives.
Excellent. Well, what a way to finish, and we're up against the clock. It's fast going against us here. So all that remains, Sarah, is to say thank you for an absolutely fascinating presentation on a very important subject that will always be super important. And we've been asked if the slides will be available. I'm sure. Well, this recording will definitely be on CISI TV, and I'm sure it can be possible for the slides to be made available to our participants as well. So thanks again, Sarah, and thank you to
Thank you.
everybody for watching. And we look forward to seeing you again soon.
Brilliant. Thanks, everyone. Reach out if I can be of any help. Thank you. Thanks,
Bye
Richard.
now.